I remember every drop of blood falling from my mouth onto the white Christmas dinner tablecloth, while my son screamed, "I want you to die already, Dad! I need your money right now!" His fists kept striking my face, and the worst part was not the physical pain. It was realizing in that moment that I had raised a murderer who had been planning my death for years. Before I continue, please subscribe and hit the bell icon because we upload new stories every day on William's Revenge Stories. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what city and state you are watching from. My name is David Miller. I am 68 years old, and throughout my life I built an empire from scratch in Chicago. Premium import-export business properties acquired with sweat and sacrifice and savings of over $3 million. I thought I had taught my son Daniel the values that really mattered, like honest work, respect, and dignity. But on the night of December the 25th, 2023, I discovered that I had failed as a father more deeply than I ever imagined. That morning, Daniel called saying he would come to dinner with his wife, Linda, and their 16-year-old son, Jacob. We had not all been together for almost 3 months. I prepared the house, ordered the turkey from Mr. Thompson's butcher shop, and bought the Napa Valley wines that Daniel had always enjoyed. My sister Rose helped with the desserts. When they arrived around 8 in the evening, the atmosphere seemed normal, although I noticed a certain tension in my son's face. His eyes avoided mine during the first few minutes. We ate dinner in relative silence for an hour. Jacob told stories from high school. Linda feigned interest in my business, but I perceived something different in the air, like when the sky turns that strange color before a storm. Around 9:30, when I was bringing out dessert, Daniel slammed the table with both hands. The noise was so loud that my sister Rose jumped in fright. "I need to talk to you, Dad, right now," he said with a voice I did not recognize. He stood up and walked toward where I was standing near the kitchen. I put down the desserts and looked him directly in the eye. "What is wrong, son? Did something bad happen?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I want you to advance my inheritance. Everything. The $3 million, the properties in Florida, the lake house. I need it now." I felt as if someone had sucked the air out of my lungs. "Excuse me, Daniel. You know that is not possible. I have worked 45 years to build this. Besides, I am alive. Why would I give you?" "Because I need it," he shouted, interrupting me. His face turned red, veins bulging in his neck. "Because I am tired of waiting. Because you are already 68, and I do not know how much time you have left." I stood in silence, paralyzed by the brutality of his words. Rose got up from the table, murmuring that she would go to the kitchen. Linda simply looked at her husband with an expression I now recognize as controlled satisfaction. Jacob had eyes full of tears. "Daniel, lower your voice. This is not the place or the time. We will talk tomorrow, calmly. Sit down and let us finish dinner." That was my mistake, asking for calm from someone who had clearly lost his a long time ago. My son advanced toward me with slow, deliberate steps. In that moment, without thinking, I took my phone out of my pocket and hit record. I do not know if it was survival instinct or simply the reflex of a man who suddenly realizes something is deeply wrong. I left the phone on the table screen down audio recording. "I'm going to tell you this only once, Dad," Daniel whispered when he was barely a foot from my face. "I have been waiting for this for years, planning for years. Linda and I have calculated exactly when you might. Well, you know, we need that money. We need it now." Fear paralyzed me. Years planning. What exactly did that mean? Before I could process his words, Daniel raised his right fist and punched me directly in the face. It was a blow so violent that I fell backward, knocking over a chair. The pain was instant and overwhelming. I felt my lip burst blood, filling my mouth, a metallic taste I will never forget. "I want you to die so I can take your inheritance," he shouted while I was on the floor dazed. "Die once and for all." He continued hitting me, his fist connecting with my ribs. Rose was screaming from the kitchen. Jacob was crying. Linda remained completely still, watching as if this were part of a previously rehearsed plan. My phone kept recording on the table. When Daniel finally stopped panting, I was curled up on the floor with blood on my mouth and my white Christmas shirt. My son looked down at me with a contempt I had never seen in his eyes before. "I hope you think better next time I ask you for something, Dad," he said. Then he left, taking Linda with him. Jacob, with cheeks wet from tears, helped me up. In that moment, lying on the floor of my own house on Christmas night, I understood that my life had turned in a direction I could not control. In the early morning of December the 26th, lying in a bed at Chicago General Hospital with bandaged ribs and a bruise covering half my face, I began to look back. Not to the recent past of that brutal night, but much further back, to the exact moment when everything started to go wrong. That moment was June 23rd, 2018, when my son Daniel married Linda in a ceremony downtown. I remember that wedding as if it were yesterday. Daniel was 34. He had worked with me in the import business for 8 years. He was a competent man, knowledgeable about the business with entrepreneurial vision. He managed our accounts with precision, participated in negotiations with clients from Italy and Canada, understood profit margins and market fluctuations. I imagined that one day he would take the reins completely, continuing the family tradition my father had started back in the 60s. Linda came into our lives like a warm summer breeze. She was beautiful and seemingly intelligent, with that type of charm that makes men lower their defenses. She worked as an independent financial advisor. When Daniel introduced her, I liked her immediately, perhaps too much. Maybe I did not see what I should have seen because I was too busy being happy for my son. The wedding was lavish. 400 guests, luxury catering, live orchestra. I covered most of the expenses, of course. He was my son. It was the occasion. I did not hesitate to invest over $30,000 in that event. I remember seeing Linda in her white dress, radiant, clinging to Daniel's arm. I remember my son smiling in a way I had not seen in years, completely captivated. But something changed that very night. During the reception, while we were toasting, I observed Linda whispering something in Daniel's ear. He nodded. Then she walked toward where I was standing with some of my business partners. She approached with a glass of champagne in her hand, with that perfect smile, which I now know is a rehearsed mask. "David, what a joy to see you tonight. I wanted to thank you personally for all this," she said, extending her hand to mine. "Daniel has told me you have been an extraordinary father and an admirable businessman. I hope you trust that I will take care of your son as he deserves." Her words were honey, but her eyes said something else. It was calculation. It was measurement. It was a value assessment. In the weeks following the wedding, I began to notice subtle changes. Daniel started missing the weekly meetings we always had at the office. First, it was trivial excuses. Then they became more frequent. I have to accompany Linda to an appointment with her accountant. Linda needs me to review some documents. I'm helping Linda with an important project. 6 months after the wedding, Daniel informed me that he wanted to reduce his hours at the company, that he needed personal space, that Linda had suggested he could dedicate himself to other private consulting projects she was developing. I asked him what kind of projects. He answered vaguely that they were alternative investments. By the end of 2018, Daniel had practically disappeared from the daily operation of the business. His desk at the office remained empty for weeks. The calls I made went unanswered until hours later. When he did attend meetings, he arrived late, his mind clearly elsewhere. I tried to talk to him on multiple occasions. "Daniel's everything okay? You seem distant lately." His answer was always the same. "Dad, Linda and I are exploring new opportunities. Maybe the import business is not our future." Our future. That language disturbed me. It was not my future, it was ours. As if Linda had completely absorbed my son, as if he were an extension of her own ambition. What I did not know at that moment was that Linda was systematically isolating Daniel from me. She controlled his schedule, managed his social media, decided which social events he would attend and which he would not. I would see it years later in the reports from the private detective I hired, emails where Linda wrote to my son, "Your father is an old man who does not understand the modern world. His business is obsolete. We need to build something different, something that is ours." In 2019, Daniel and Linda bought a house in a wealthy suburb called Oakbrook, a property that cost $430,000. Money that, as I later discovered, came from bank loans Linda had managed under Daniel's name. My son did not have the capital for such an investment, but Linda knew how to access credit, how to present documentation cleverly. Jacob was born in March 2019. When I held my grandson in my arms at the hospital, I thought this would be a turning point, a moment that would bring Daniel closer to me again. Nothing could be further from the truth. Linda used the birth as another tool of control. Daniel needs to focus on the family. Now she would say every time I invited my son to business events, "This is not the time for business, David. Your son has new responsibilities." By the end of 2019, Daniel had practically become a ghostly presence in my life. He visited my house less and less frequently. Phone calls became spaced out. When we did meet, there was a coldness in his demeanor I could not explain. He accused me of being too hardworking, of having neglected the family during my youth. Words that clearly did not come from his own reflection, but were whispered by Linda in the privacy of their home. In 2020, while the world closed down due to the pandemic, Daniel pulled away completely. He refused to attend family dinners. He claimed mobility restrictions. When I finally visited him at his house in Oakbrook, wearing a mask and keeping a safe distance, Linda opened the door and simply said, "Daniel prefers not to have visitors right now. He hopes you understand." Understand? How does a father understand being excluded like that by his own son? Years passed, years of distance, years of unanswered questions, years of watching a man who had come from my own flesh be consumed gradually by someone who clearly did not love him, but used him like a puppet. And lying in that hospital bed at 68, finally I understood. Linda had not come into my son's life for love. She had arrived with a precise plan. Isolate control and prepare the ground for something much more sinister. The nursing station at Chicago General smelled of disinfectant and something darker I could not identify. Perhaps it was the smell of my own fears materializing in that sterile space. 24 hours had passed since the assault. My ribs were wrapped in tight bandages. An IV tube administered painkillers every 4 hours. My upper lip looked like it belonged to a boxer after 12 rounds. On the morning of December the 27th, while I remained motionless in that bed, I received an unexpected visit. Daniel entered the room, accompanied by Linda. His expression feigned concern, but his eyes revealed something completely different. They were calculating, measuring, evaluating. "Dad, we are so sorry about yesterday." Daniel began approaching my bed as if to hug me, but stopped halfway. It was an outburst. Emotions overwhelmed us. An outburst. Is that what they called attempting to kill me? Linda positioned herself near the window, looking outside as if the landscape were more interesting than my suffering. "The doctors said you will need several days of recovery," she observed without addressing anyone specifically. "How long did you plan to be here?" The question seemed strange to me. It was not a question of concern. It was a logistical question. A question from someone who was calculating times and movements. According to the doctors, probably a week. I answered cautiously, observing their reactions. They need to ensure there is no serious internal damage. Daniel sat in the chair next to my bed. "Have you spoken to the police?" he asked directly. That was the moment I knew with certainty that something was fundamentally corrupt in all of this. Why would my own son ask me if I had contacted the police unless? Not yet. I lied. I have been focused on recovering. "Good," Linda said from the window. "Because it would be a disaster for the family reputation if this became public, especially considering your position in the Chicago business community." There was a veiled threat in her words, a suggestion that keeping quiet would be the wisest thing. After they left, about an hour later, I received another visit. This time it was the nurse on duty, a woman of about 55, named Martha. She had that kind of face that has seen too much, that knows the truth behind many stories patients tell in these hallways. Martha was checking my vital signs, verifying the monitors, when she leaned close to my ear. "You need to know something," she whispered. "About an hour ago, a young man came to the reception desk. He said he was your son. He tried to access your medical records. He asked me to provide information about your exams, your x-rays, details of your complete physical state. The receptionist told him that was not possible without your express consent. He insisted, saying he had rights as a son." My heart accelerated inside my chest, causing the heart rate monitor to emit a soft alarm. What information exactly was he trying to obtain? I asked, keeping my voice low. "Everything," Martha answered while adjusting my IV. "He wanted to know the extent of your injuries, if there was possible neurological damage, if you were on strong medication. He also asked about your admission documents, if you had signed anything, what your current mental state was. It was very specific, too specific to be simple family concern." My mind began connecting dots I should have connected years ago. Daniel was not worried about my well-being. He was assessing the extent of the damage he had caused. He was determining if he had made a mistake calculating the intensity of the assault. "Martha, this is important," I said. "Did you share any information with him?" "No. Our policy is clear, but I wanted you to know. I have been working here 23 years. I know when something is not right. What I see here, the way that young man speaks, the way his wife watches him." She paused. "There is something dark in that." That afternoon, after Martha finished her shift, I requested the nursing staff not to allow visitors without my specific consent. I explained that I needed peace to recover. The request was accepted without question. Probably other patients did the same, but in my case it was a protective measure. It was acknowledging that the danger did not come from outside the hospital, but from my own blood. During the next 3 days in the hospital, I had time to think, time to reflect, time to relive conversations I had dismissed as insignificant for years. I remembered when Daniel was 25 and confided that Linda had inspired him to explore new ways to generate income. I remembered how his visits to my house became shorter, colder. I remembered how he avoided talking about money with me, even though I knew his financial situation was deteriorating. I remembered a conversation with my sister Rose 2 years ago where she mentioned, "David, that marriage has something sick about it. I saw Linda looking at your house as if she were calculating how much it could be worth." Had I been blind all this time, or simply had I not wanted to see the truth, because the truth was too painful? On the morning of December 30th, when I was about to be discharged, an unexpected visitor showed up. It was Brian Peterson, a lawyer my sister Rose had contacted without my knowledge. Brian was a specialist in criminal and family law. He was about my age, with gray hair and that expression of someone who has seen the worst of human nature and learned not to be surprised. "Your sister explained the situation," Brian said without preamble, "and you need to hear this. What happened in your house was not an impulsive act, it was planned. The injuries you suffered have characteristics of a premeditated attack. Furthermore, if what Rose told me is correct about the questions your son was asking regarding documents and properties, we are talking about a pattern of criminal behavior that goes far beyond an isolated domestic assault." Brian pulled a portfolio from his leather bag. "I have reviewed the legal background of your son and his wife. Daniel has a history of debts dating back to 2021. Linda has been involved in at least 3 lawsuits for financial fraud, although she was never convicted. The cases were closed through out-of-court settlements." My stomach clenched. "Are you saying they knew exactly what they were doing?" "I am saying we need to hire someone, a private investigator. We need to document exactly what is happening in that household And more importantly, we need to secure your assets before they try to make legal moves to access them. That was when I decided to make the only call I could have made weeks ago if I had had the courage. I called Ethan Roberts, a licensed private detective who had been recommended by Brian's firm. Ethan promised to start the investigation immediately. As I left the hospital that December 30th, with a sore back and a shattered heart, I finally understood that the attacker on that Christmas night had not acted alone. He had been the instrument of someone much smarter, much more dangerous. He had been the executor of a plan that had been weaving itself for almost 5 years, since June 23rd, 2018, when a beautiful woman entered my son's life with a smile that hid pure predation. Ethan Roberts arrived at my home on January 2nd, 2024, with a brown folder under his arm and that characteristic look of someone who has investigated enough lies to recognize them instantly. He was a man of about 60, with a gray beard, trimmed with precision, dressed simply but impeccably. His office occupied the second floor of a discreet building downtown. For 3 hours, Ethan asked me exhaustive questions from trivial details about Daniel's daily routine to complex financial aspects of my business. He took notes in a small notebook, nodding occasionally without interrupting my explanations. When he finally closed his notebook, he looked me directly in the eyes. "This is going to be complicated," he said simply, "but I am going to need access to your bank records, property documents, any communication you have had with your son in the last 3 years, and I am going to need you to formally authorize me to conduct investigations into Daniel and Linda's finances." I provided everything he asked for access to my bank accounts, property documents, emails, I had kept text messages, even the recording from that Christmas night, which I extracted from my phone and saved on a secure storage device. During the next 2 weeks, while I recovered from my wounds at my residence in Chicago, Ethan worked tirelessly. He conducted surveillance, visited financial institutions, spoke with people he had identified as relevant. He did not share information with me during that period, only sending brief messages confirming he was making progress in the investigation. On January 15th, Ethan requested an urgent meeting at his office. When I arrived, I found him surrounded by documents scattered on a large wooden table. His expression was serious, concentrated, with that tinge of disgust someone experiences when they finally understand the magnitude of human depravity. "I have found a pattern," Ethan began without preamble, "a pattern that starts in 2021. He pulled a document from a manila folder. It was a bank statement from a Chase account in Daniel Miller's name. He pointed to a series of monthly transfers starting in February 2021. "Here," he said, placing his finger on his computer screen. "Transfers of $1,800 to $2,300 monthly to a platform called DraftKings. Here, transfers similar to BetMGM. Here to 3 other online gambling platforms. The amounts increased gradually. In January 2023, your son was transferring over $4,000 monthly to these sites." I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "How much in total?" $120,000, Ethan answered without hesitation. "From February 2021 to October 2023, $120,000 spent on online gambling platforms." He continued unfolding more documents, credit card statements, personal loan applications, lines of credit Daniel had opened without my knowledge. Everything painted a picture of a man trapped in a spiral of debt, getting deeper and deeper. "There is more," Ethan continued. "Here is the interesting part. In March 2023, approximately 9 months before the assault, your son and his wife applied for an additional mortgage loan on the Oakbrook property, a loan of $150,000. The stated purpose was home renovation. In reality, it was dispersed directly to an account owned by Linda. Ethan opened another folder. Here are the movements of that account. Fractional transfers, probably to evade money, laundering detection to accounts in Luxembourg. After that, the trail gets fuzzy, but everything suggests Linda was moving money to offshore jurisdictions. Are you saying they stole? I am saying they obtained money under false pretenses, Ethan clarified. Was it technically theft? That depends on how a prosecutor interprets the facts, but without a doubt, it was mortgage fraud. Then Ethan pulled out a document that left me frozen. It was a printed email dated August 2023 from Linda to Daniel. I got this through channels I prefer not to explain in detail, Ethan said, but it is authentic. Look at it. The email said, Daniel, we have spent too much. The situation is unsustainable. Your father has over $3 million. His properties are worth another $1.4 million. His business generates approximately $400,000 a year. We cannot go on like this. We need to accelerate the plan. Talk to him about the inheritance. Push him. If it does not work, we are going to need to take more drastic measures. Your father will not live forever. We can make this happen much sooner. L. I read the email 3 times. Each reading was more visceral than the last. More drastic measures. Are you saying that? I am saying there is textual evidence of premeditation, Ethan answered with professional calm. Your son and his wife were not simply thinking about access to money. They were considering accelerating your death. The rest of the meeting was a blur. Ethan spoke about forensic documentation, about how to proceed legally, about the importance of protecting my assets immediately, but the only thing I heard in my head was that phrase, we can make this happen much sooner. That email was what finally sealed my determination. It was not just that Daniel had hit me, it was that he had planned it, that his wife had encouraged him, that they were seriously considering murder as a solution to their financial problems. Leaving Ethan's office that afternoon of January 15th, I called Brian Peterson. I need to change my will, I told him without preamble, and I need to make some immediate financial moves. After that, we are going to file criminal charges against my son. That night in my study, surrounded by the documents Ethan had collected, I made a decision I knew would alter the course of my life forever. I was going to protect myself. I was going to protect my family. And I was going to ensure Daniel faced the consequences of what he had done, not only to me, but to the innocence that remained in our last name. On January 18th, 2024, Ethan summoned me to his office again. This time, his expression was different. It was not just professional seriousness. It was something closer to controlled indignation of someone who has discovered a conspiracy that transcended the limits of what he had initially anticipated. I found something, he said, placing a thick folder on the table. Something you need to see before taking any definitive legal decision. He opened the folder. Inside were property documents, notary records, printed electronic communications. Ethan began to explain methodically what he had discovered during the last 72 hours of intensive investigation. In July 2022, your son filed a request with the notary in Chicago for the transfer of the rural property in Florida, the property we evaluated at $350,000. The request included your signature, or more precisely, a forgery of your signature. Ethan pulled out 2 documents, placing them side by side. Here is your authentic signature from 3 years ago on a business contract. Here's the signature on the transfer document. Note the subtle differences, the pen pressure, the angle of the letters, the spacing. A handwriting expert confirmed to me that the second is definitely a forgery. My heart began to race. What happened with the transfer? Was it completed? Almost, Ethan answered. The notary required additional confirmation. When they called your registered phone number, it was your sister Rose who answered. She assured them there must be an administrative error. The transfer was halted. Otherwise, your property would have been sold without your knowledge to a third party, money that presumably would have ended up in Daniel and Linda's hands. Ethan continued unfolding more information. Internet searches he had tracked on Daniel's browser. Investigations on how to declare legal incapacity of the elderly. queries about interdiction procedures for seniors with dementia, websites about specialized nursing homes for older adults. All registered between September and November 2023. David, Ethan said slowly, your son and his wife were not only considering murder, they were actively investigating how to declare you legally incapacitated. The plan was probably multiple. First, try to get money directly through emotional manipulation or forgery. If that fails, declare him senile, obtain legal power over his assets, and proceed with the transfer of assets under legal authority as his guardian. I felt nauseous. Is there more? Much more, Ethan confirmed. He then pulled out a series of emails between Daniel and Linda, dated in November 2023, just weeks before the Christmas assault, reading them aloud. Daniel, have you spoken to Dad about the inheritance thing, as I suggested? Linda, I did not want to push, but I know we are in a critical situation. The debts are out of control. Daniel, I spoke to him last week. He refused flatly. Linda, then we will proceed to Plan B. We need to accelerate this. Your father is 68. We do not know how much time we have left. We can file for legal incapacity in January, but first we need him to understand we are not joking. Daniel, what do you suggest? Linda, a show of authority, something that scares him, that makes him understand he is at a disadvantage. I will take care of the details. Trust me. That last sentence was sent on November 20th. Ethan clarified, 35 days before the assault. I could barely process what I was hearing. It was not an enraged son acting impulsively. It was a coordinated plot. It was a meticulous conspiracy with multiple phases, with contingencies, with specific objectives. Ethan then did something I did not anticipate. He got up and walked toward a wall where he had a series of photographs taped up, surveillance photographs, showing Daniel and Linda in different locations: bank, notary, lawyer's office, entrance of a municipal administrative building. I've been following their movements for 14 days, Ethan explained. Daniel visited the civil records office on 2 occasions. Linda contacted 3 different lawyers, all specialists in family law and incapacity proceedings. On January 3, 2024, 3 days after your release from the hospital, Daniel completed a preliminary application to declare you mentally incapacitated. The application is under administrative review. It will be processed in approximately 2 weeks if no one challenges it. That was the breaking point for me. It was not the assault. It was not the emails. It was the realization that not even after failing with violence did they stop executing the plan. They kept going as if nothing had happened, as if they had learned nothing. Ethan watched me for several seconds. Then he asked, "What do you want to do?" "I want to destroy them," I answered without thinking. Then more calmly, I added, "I want to protect myself. I want to protect my family, and I want them to face real, legal consequences." That night I called Jacob for the first time since the assault. My grandson answered on the second ring. His voice seemed nervous, as if he doubted whether he should speak to me. "Jacob, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth," I said softly. "When was the last time you heard your father and mother talk about me? Specifically, did you hear the word inheritance or money mentioned?" There was a prolonged silence. Then, with a barely audible voice, Jacob began to speak. He told me he had heard his parents arguing repeatedly for months, that he had heard his mother saying, "Your grandfather is in the way of our fortune," that he had heard his father responding that, "We cannot wait much longer," that the night before Christmas dinner, Jacob had heard them planning specifically the confrontation with his grandfather. His father was nervous. His mother was giving him instructions. "Do not lose your nerve until after you push. Make him believe he is in real danger. Hit him enough so he understands we are serious." Jacob cried while telling me this. He cried because he knew the truth, because he had heard his mother turn his father into an instrument of violence, because he was smart enough to understand that all this was completely wrong, but he was young enough to feel powerless about it. "Grandpa," Jacob asked with a broken voice, "are they going to go to jail?" "Yes, honey," I answered. "They are going to have to answer for what they have done." I spent 3 days in absolute silence after talking to Jacob. 3 days where I barely ate, where I slept irregularly, where the weight of reality settled on my shoulders like a slab of granite. Brian Peterson had recommended that I take time to reflect before proceeding with legal actions. He said cases like mine, where the motivation was clearly economic and premeditation was documented, required a carefully orchestrated strategy. But I did not want strategy. I wanted truth. I wanted my family to understand exactly what had happened. And I wanted to do it face to face in a space where they could not run, where they could not feign innocence. On January 23rd, 2024, I convened a family meeting. It was not easy. I called Daniel directly and informed him I needed to see him along with Linda, that Rose would be present, that Jacob should also attend. There was immediate resistance. "Why do you need to see us, Dad?" Daniel asked with that fake concern which I now recognized as his usual mask. "Are you okay? Are there health problems? Just show up at the house at 7 p.m." I answered without further explanation. That afternoon, while waiting for their arrival, I felt a fear I had not experienced even during the assault. It was the fear of a father confirming definitely that his son was a stranger, that the 19 years I had dedicated to raising him, to teaching him values, to building a business alongside him, had been completely annulled by the influence of a woman and his own moral weaknesses. Rose arrived first, around 6:30. She carried a folder with copies of all the documentation Ethan had collected. When she entered the living room, she hugged me without saying anything. We did not need words. My sister had been a witness to how the family had crumbled gradually, and although she had tried to warn me, she knew the full weight of the truth had not yet been fully processed by me. At 7 p.m. exactly, Daniel, Linda, and Jacob walked through the front door. Linda entered first with that posture of security that characterized predators. Daniel followed, looking around as if he had not been in that house for years. Jacob came behind his eyes, clearly swollen from having cried recently. "Thank you for coming," I began, keeping my voice deliberately calm. "Rose, Brian, Ethan, and I have been working on something important. I need everyone to listen to what we are going to share." Brian and Ethan were already waiting in the living room. Their sober presences immediately created palpable tension. Linda straightened up, her expression hardening perceptibly. "What is this?" she asked with that tone I had learned to identify as a veiled threat, an intervention, because if it is about Daniel's debts, that is between us and our bank. "It is not an intervention," I responded. "It is a confrontation based on documented facts." Ethan stood up, then holding a folder identical to the one I had seen in his office. He began distributing copies of documents to Daniel and Linda. Emails, bank statements, records of transfers. Documentation of the forgery of the Florida property. While they analyzed them, I observed their reactions. Daniel paled gradually. Linda, for her part, maintained an almost theatrical composure, as if all this were a show she had seen before. These documents show a systematic pattern of debt, mortgage fraud, forgery of legal documents, and what could be interpreted as premeditation of severe bodily harm. Brian explained with the precision of someone who has presented evidence in courts hundreds of times. What happened at Christmas was not an emotional outburst. It was the result of a carefully executed plan whose genesis dates back at least 18 months. "This is ridiculous," Linda interrupted, although her voice had lost part of its previous bravado. "You are misinterpreting private communications. Emails can be forged. Daniel's debts are not David's responsibility. And regarding that night, it was an emotional argument that got out of control. Any competent lawyer will defend it as a temporary defense of insanity." "Perhaps," Brian conceded, "but there is an element that makes that defense more complicated. The application you filed, Daniel, on January 3rd to declare your father mentally incapacitated. That suggests that after a physical assault, which supposedly was impulsive, you continued executing a coordinated legal plan. That is not compatible with temporary insanity. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Dad, I do not know what you are talking about. Linda suggested some things to me, but I never. Never what? I interrupted. Never hit her. I have the recording. Never forged property documents. We have handwriting analysis. Never planned to declare me incapacitated. We have the application you filed. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jacob spoke for the first time since they had entered. His voice was small but clear. Grandpa is right. I heard Mom telling you exactly what to do that night. I heard Mom telling you to hit him so he understood you were serious. I heard all the plans. About the inheritance, about declaring him crazy, about selling his properties. Linda turned toward her son, her face transforming into something almost demonic. Jacob, you do not know what you are talking about. You are confused. Your grandfather has. My grandson is the only honest person in this room, I declared, standing up from my seat. And this ends here. Daniel, I have modified my will. You are completely excluded from any inheritance. My assets will go to a trust fund for Jacob, accessible only when he turns 25. I have transferred my main assets to accounts that are legally protected from any claim you try to make. I continued without allowing interruptions. I will file criminal charges against both of you for assault, forgery, mortgage fraud, and what could constitute attempted murder, based on the emails documenting the consideration of more drastic measures. Yes, Brian is filing a restraining order. You will not be able to come near me, my property, or my company within 100 yards. If you violate it, you will be jailed. Daniel began to cry. Linda remained motionless, her mask finally cracked to reveal the true nature she had been hiding for years. Come on, Jacob, I said, extending my hand to my grandson. You are coming with me. Your mother has spoken enough for today. As Jacob stood up and took my hand, I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart, even more. Relief, the relief of a child who had finally been heard, whose truth had been validated, whose burden had been shared. It was then when I really understood the extent of the damage. Not only had they betrayed me, they had betrayed an innocent teenager, forcing him to be an accomplice to their plans, forcing him to keep secrets that were devouring him from the inside. The 30 days that followed that confrontation were the most intense of my life. Not emotionally, although certainly they were. I referred to the intensity of the decisions, to the magnitude of the transformations I had to execute. Brian and his legal team worked tirelessly filing documentation with the courts, but while they navigated the judicial system, I had to face something more fundamental, dismantling the life I had built for 45 years. The decision to sell the import business was not impulsive, although it might seem so externally. I had reflected on it for 2 weeks after the confrontation with Daniel. Every morning, I woke up in the house where I had lived for 32 years, surrounded by furniture that had been witnesses to happy moments that now seemed contaminated by betrayal. The company which had been my professional legacy, my pride, my connection to my father and his father before him, had become something different. It represented continuity with Daniel. It represented hope that one day he would inherit something of value, something of meaning, but that hope was dead. In early February, I contacted 3 private investment firms that had shown interest in acquiring the company over the last few years. All had presented preliminary offers in the past. The most recent, from an investment fund called Liberty Capital Partners, had valued the operation at $2.9 million. That number, although substantial, was not what motivated me. It was closure. It was the elimination of that link Daniel could use as an argument to claim inheritance rights over something I had built with my own hands. The sale process was methodological, hiring independent auditors, facilitating access to financial records, negotiating terms. Everything was relatively simple because Liberty Capital Partners was genuinely interested in the operation. The Chicago Import Company had a solid reputation, established clients, consistent profit margins. For an investment fund, it was an attractive asset. What was difficult was the emotional aspect. One afternoon, while reviewing the last sale documents in the office I had occupied for over 4 decades, I found myself crying uncontrollably in front of an old photograph. It showed my father, me at 30, and Daniel at 8, all smiling in front of our first distribution trucks. That photo represented 3 generations of dedication, of sacrifice, of hope, and I was selling it because my son had tried to kill me. Rose entered the office at that moment and simply sat beside me without saying anything. After several minutes, she asked, "Do you regret it?" "No," I answered, "but it hurts. Pain is the price of having loved." Rose replied with the wisdom that characterized my sister. "And you still love Daniel, even if you do not want to admit it. That is why it hurts so much." She was right, of course. I still loved the son he once was. I kept looking in my mind for the teenager who helped in the office after school, who joked with employees, who seemed genuinely interested in continuing the family tradition. But that son no longer existed. He had been replaced by a stranger who shared his face and name. On February 26, 2024, the sale of the company was finalized. The funds, approximately $2,930,000 after taxes and fees, were transferred to 3 separate bank accounts I had established under Brian's advice. One account was secured specifically for Jacob in trust until he turned 25. The other 2 were under legal protection, making it practically impossible for Daniel to claim them even if he won some kind of future litigation. Simultaneously, I had begun the process of testamentary modification. The original document, drafted 15 years ago, designated Daniel as the main heir with clauses providing Linda certain widowhood benefits. That document was canceled completely. The new will drafted by Brian established that my assets would be distributed as follows: 60% to Jacob's trust fund, 30% to Rose and her children, 10% to charities specializing in child protection and victims of domestic abuse. Daniel received nothing, nothing of the material goods, nothing of the inheritance, nothing of the business legacy. I documented every step of the process, recorded communications with my accountant, kept copies of all legal documents. Every financial transaction was recorded meticulously, not because I distrusted Brian or my lawyers, but because I knew Daniel would try to question these decisions, that he would argue I was under some kind of influence, that he would seek to annul the will based on claims of mental incompetence. During this period, I also had to make decisions about my real estate properties. I owned 3 properties besides the house where I lived in Chicago, the rural property in Florida, which Daniel had tried to forge a vacation house on the lake, and an investment condo downtown. After considerable reflection, I decided to sell all of them. I did not need them. At my age, traveling constantly no longer had the same appeal as in previous years. The properties represented administrative complexity, and more importantly, they represented assets Daniel could claim, or over which he could exert pressure. The sale of the Florida property was the most significant. It was valued at $335,000. A local buyer, an agricultural businessman, made the purchase quickly. The lake house sold at a similar price, the downtown condo slightly less. In total, I generated approximately $900,000 in additional liquidity. When all these transactions were completed in late March, I found myself in a financial position different from any other I had known. It was not that I was poor. I still had substantial resources, probably more than I would spend for the rest of my life. But I had transformed my wealth from something tangible, inheritable, transferable, to something more abstract and protected. All in 300 days of ceaseless activity. One night, while reviewing the last closing documents of the real estate transactions, I realized something surprising. Despite the magnitude of the losses, despite having dismantled 45 years of business construction, I felt lighter, as if I had been carrying an invisible weight for years without recognizing its existence. That weight was the expectation that Daniel would continue my legacy, that my efforts were not just mine, but an investment in his future, that the company I built would have a family name in its leadership generations after I departed. By selling the company, by excluding Daniel from the will, by liquidating the properties, I had eliminated that expectation. I was no longer building for him. I was no longer sacrificing for his future. I was building for me, for my mental peace, for my security, for my dignity. It was an unexpected relief. On April 16th, 2024, the Cook County Court cited Daniel Miller and Linda Miller to appear before the instructing judge in relation to the charges I had formally filed 3 weeks prior. Brian had prepared me extensively for this moment. He had explained the procedures, the possible lines of defense they would employ, how to keep calm during testimony, but no amount of preparation could have replicated the reality of sitting in front of my son and his wife, while a judge listened to evidence about their intentions to cause me severe harm. The courtroom was austere, painted in an institutional gray that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. I sat in the witness section next to Brian, who had before him a thick folder of documentation. On the other side of the room, Daniel and Linda were accompanied by their defense attorney, a man named Vincent Ruiz, who had acquired certain notoriety in Chicago for defending white-collar criminals in fraud cases. The judge, a magistrate of about 65 named Judge Harrison, began reviewing the formal charges. Aggravated assault, document forgery, mortgage fraud, attempted fraudulent incapacitation, premeditation based on textual evidence. "We will present the recording evidence first," Brian announced. The recording from that Christmas night was played on the courtroom speakers. Hearing Daniel's screams, again his words about planning my death, the sound of his fists impacting my body was visceral. No matter how many times I had heard that recording during the previous months, each playback transported me back to that specific moment where my world had crumbled. When the playback ended, Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Daniel. "Do you recognize your voice in the recording?" Daniel did not answer initially. His lawyer whispered something in his ear. Then, in a low voice, Daniel admitted, "Yes, but it was in the context of an emotional argument. It does not represent my true intentions. It does not represent your true intentions," Judge Harrison replied, his eyebrows rising. "However, in the recording, you clearly expressed desires for your father to die, to access an inheritance. Was that also emotional?" Vincent Ruiz intervened. "My client is going through significant financial difficulties. In a moment of extreme stress, he expressed feelings of frustration that were amplified disproportionately by the confrontation. But expressing frustration under pressure is not a crime." Brian stood up. With respect, the defense ignores the textual evidence preceding this confrontation by months. I can present correspondence between the defendant and his wife, specifically planning this confrontation. Correspondence using the language of show of authority and reference to more drastic measures. That is not spontaneous frustration. That is premeditation. What followed was a methodical presentation of evidence that lasted approximately 3 hours. Ethan was called to testify about his findings. He presented bank statements showing $120,000 in transfers to gambling platforms. He showed the incapacitation application Daniel had filed 3 days after the assault. He explained the forgery of the Florida property. Then it was the turn of a handwriting expert who had been hired by the court. He presented comparative analysis of Daniel's authentic signature versus the forged one on the property transfer document. His conclusions were unequivocal. The signature on the transfer document was not made by me. It was a deliberate forgery. When they called me to testify, I walked to the witness box with deliberate slowness. I wanted the judge to see my age, the scars of the injuries still visible on my face, the physical reality of what had happened. Brian questioned me first, allowing me to recount Christmas night completely without interruptions. I described how Daniel had arrived at my house, how he had demanded I advance the inheritance, how he had lost control when I rejected the request. Then, during cross-examination, Vincent Ruiz tried to discredit my version. "Is it not true, Mr. Miller, that you have been favoring your sister Rose over your son for years, that Daniel felt he was being marginalized in the family business?" "That is completely false," I answered. "Daniel was marginalized because he decided to leave the business voluntarily after his wife's influence. And now you are seeking revenge against your son through these accusations." Vincent pressed. "I am not seeking revenge," I answered calmly. "I am seeking justice. There is an important difference." What was particularly devastating for the defense was when Jacob was called to testify. My grandson, despite his evident discomfort, described with precision what he had heard his parents planning, how his mother had specifically instructed his father on how to execute the assault, how he had heard discussions about accelerating my death. Vincent tried to suggest Jacob was being influenced by me, that his testimonies were unreliable because he was my grandson. Judge Harrison stopped him. "Mr. Ruiz, the minor's testimony has been consistent, specific, and has withstood cross-examination adequately. The accusations against your clients are serious, but the evidence presented today is substantial." After the testimonies, both sides presented closing arguments. Brian was blunt, summarizing the evidence into a clear pattern of premeditated crime with economic motivation. Vincent tried to argue everything was circumstantial, that emails could be misinterpreted, that the recording reflected an isolated moment of anger. Judge Harrison took his notes and announced the sentence would be issued within 3 weeks. Leaving the courtroom that April 16th, I ran into Linda in the hallways. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no regret in her gaze, there was calculation. She was measuring implications, determining her next move, already planning how to protect her own future. It was in that instant when I really understood that predators never genuinely regret, they simply adjust their strategy. The sentence arrived on May 8th, 2024, exactly 3 weeks after the hearing. Judge Harrison had used that time to consider meticulously the evidence, the arguments, the relevant legal precedents. When Brian called to inform me of the result, his voice conveyed controlled satisfaction. 2 years of probation, he said, a 100-yard restraining order, freezing of assets during the mortgage fraud investigation, civil compensation of $25,000 for you. I felt a strange mix of emotions. It was not joy, it was not complete satisfaction. It was something more nuanced, the feeling that something broken had been partially repaired, although the fundamental damage remained irreversible. Daniel would not enter prison immediately. Probation meant he would remain free while appealing, as long as he did not violate the conditions of his freedom. However, the restraining order was executed immediately. He could not come near me, my home, my properties, or my workplace within 100 yards. Violations would result in immediate imprisonment. What happened next was perhaps more significant than the sentence itself. Daniel lost his job almost simultaneously with the publication of the sentence. His boss, the director of a financial consultancy where he had worked for 3 years under a relatively discreet identity, decided that having someone convicted of fraud on his payroll was an unacceptable business risk. Daniel was fired without formal cause, although the real cause was evident. Simultaneously, Linda faced more severe consequences in financial terms. The bank that had granted the fraudulent mortgage loan on the Oakbrook property initiated legal recovery procedures. They alleged the income documents she had presented during the application were falsified, that she and Daniel had deliberately defrauded the bank. The institution requested the entire debt, of $150,000 be paid immediately, plus fines and accrued interest, bringing the total debt to almost $200,000. Linda did not have the resources to pay that amount. Her personal assets were minimal. Her independent financial advisory business, which turned out to be completely fictitious, as Ethan discovered, had never generated real income. It was simply an administrative vehicle to channel money from Daniel to her schemes. The consequence was predictable. Linda was forced to file for divorce from Daniel, not for romantic reasons, but for purely strategic reasons. If they remained married, creditors could pursue joint assets. By divorcing, she tried to protect any asset she could claim under her sole name. Ethan kept me informed of these developments through regular updates. He saw Daniel being evicted from the house in Oak Brook in June 2024. I saw Linda listing the property for forced sale. I saw how the empire of lies they had built crumbled with the speed of a sand structure under persistent waves. In mid-June, approximately a week after Daniel was evicted from the marital home, Ethan presented additional information he had discovered. Daniel had been living in a modest rental apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, in a neighborhood that was not exactly low class, but was substantially less opulent than his previous life. His social network had contracted dramatically. Business friends who once surrounded him had disappeared. His income, which had once been stable, was now non-existent. It was during this period that I began my own preparations to leave Chicago. It was not an impulsive decision. I had been considering it since February. Chicago was saturated with memories that were now toxic. Every street reminded me of the family that once was. Every business reminded me of the company I no longer owned. Every corner of the city seemed contaminated by betrayal. I selected San Diego as my destination. It was distant enough from Chicago to represent a true change, but not so far as to be impractical in terms of ongoing legal matters. It was a coastal city, something I had always found attractive. It was a place where I could rebuild without the weight constantly present of what I had lost. In June, I hired real estate agents to help me find an appropriate condo. After reviewing multiple properties, I selected a 2-bedroom apartment in a secure residential area near the beach. It was modest compared to my previous residence in Chicago, but that was precisely the point. I did not want ostentation. I wanted functionality. I wanted peace. The move happened on June 24th, 2024. Rose helped me along with 2 of my nephews. While packing my personal possessions, I found myself discarding a lot. Family photographs that now seemed like visual lies. Gifts from Daniel representing moments I now knew had been transactional. Souvenirs I once valued but now seemed contaminated. What I took with me was deliberately minimal. Clothes, books, important documents, photos of my parents, some pieces of art I had acquired over the years. The rest was sold, donated, or simply discarded. When I closed the door of my Chicago house for the last time, I did not feel the sadness I would have expected. I felt relief, as if I were abandoning a place haunted by ghosts of broken promises. San Diego received me with June warmth. While I arranged my new apartment, Ethan continued his investigation work remotely, monitoring Daniel and providing me periodic updates. My son had obtained a modest job at a logistics company, earning approximately $1,200 a month. It was not enough to cover his financial obligations. He was living literally day to day without resources, without professional prospects, without the safety net his father once had provided. I did not feel satisfaction learning this. I felt mainly indifference. The person with whom I had shared 25 years of life no longer existed in my emotional consciousness. He had been replaced by a stranger whose actions had consequences, but whose suffering no longer touched me personally. In July 2024, I established a small consultancy for import trade advice. It was not for financial necessity. It was for psychological necessity. I needed work. I needed purpose. I needed to reaffirm that my identity was not completely tied to my role as a father or main businessman. I could be more than that. I could be someone new in a new city, rebuilding from the fragments of who I had been. Daniel appeared in my life again on September 18th, 2024, 3 months after moving to San Diego. 3 months during which I had tried to build an existence that did not revolve completely around the trauma of his betrayal. I received an unexpected phone call while I was in my consulting office, reviewing shipping specifications for a client in Italy. The number was not in my contacts, but I recognized the area code as Chicago. I hesitated for 2 seconds before answering. "Dad." The voice was Daniel's, but different, smaller, more cautious. "I need to talk to you." My first instinct was to hang up. My second instinct was to listen. I chose the second. "How did you get this number?" I asked, keeping myself deliberately neutral. I had been very careful not to allow personal contact information to circulate widely after moving. Brian gave me the number. He said there was no longer legal conflict in us communicating directly, as long as I respected the restraining order. "Dad, I need to see you. I need to explain some things to you." "There is nothing to explain, Daniel. The courts have already heard enough. Please," he insisted. His voice contained something that seemed genuine. Or maybe he was simply a more refined predator, now better at the art of emotional manipulation. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I am not asking you to trust me. I just need you to hear me. Once that is all." Against my better judgment, I agreed to a meeting, but not in San Diego. That was too much neutral territory, too intimate. I suggested we meet at a public cafe in Chicago. Neutral, witnessed, controlled. On September the 23rd, I flew back to Chicago for the first time since my departure in June. The city seemed simultaneously familiar and strange, as if I had visited it in a previous life, and now was seeing through the eyes of someone completely different. Daniel arrived at the cafe approximately 10 minutes after I arrived. He looked destroyed, not metaphorically, literally. He had lost significant weight. His clothes, which once had been impeccable, now showed signs of wear. His eyes had that sunken look of someone who was not sleeping properly. He sat across from me without asking permission. For several seconds, he simply looked at me as if he were trying to locate the man he had once known inside the stranger he was seeing. I went through therapy. He began without preamble, a psychiatrist recommended by my lawyer. During the last 5 months, I have been attending weekly sessions. At first, I did not want to be there. I thought it was a legal formality, but after a few weeks, I began to be honest with the therapist about my life, about my decisions, about how I had allowed Linda to manipulate my behavior completely. I listened without interrupting. It was a tactic I had learned during the last few months. Silence was often more revealing than any question I could ask. Linda was not simply a bad influence, Daniel continued. She was deliberately designed to isolate me, to make me dependent on her. When I did not meet her demands, she used emotional manipulation. When that did not work, she used intimidation. I was too weak to resist. I think part of me always knew that what we were doing was wrong, but it was easier to follow her lead than confront her. Where is Linda now? I asked more for practical interest than genuine curiosity. In Miami, with someone new, probably someone else with resources to exploit. We have no contact. It is better this way. He paused. "Dad, what happened at Christmas? What we planned for months before that, I cannot simply apologize and expect that to fix it. I caused harm, serious harm. I tried to steal from you. I tried to isolate your mind through fraudulent documents. I tried to." His voice broke, literally broke. Tears began to descend down his cheeks. For someone who for 5 months had operated under the premise that his son was incapable of genuine emotion, it was disturbing. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness," Daniel continued when he recovered composure partially, "but I needed you to know that I recognize what I did. I am not asking you to take me back. I'm not asking us to go back to how we were before, just I needed you to hear that I really understand how deeply I betrayed you. I watched my son for several minutes without speaking. I was trying to determine if this was genuine or simply a more sophisticated tactic, an attempt to rebuild some kind of relationship he could exploit later. But then I realized it really did not matter if it was genuine or not. Genuineness did not annul damage. Regret did not restore trust that had been broken so fundamentally. Daniel, I said finally, your therapy is your responsibility, not mine. The fact that you are processing what happened is positive for you, but that does not change anything between us. It does not change that you tried to kill me. It does not change that you forged documents. It does not change that you systematically planned to destroy my life. I know, he answered. I have spent 5 months building a new life in San Diego. I have spent 5 months avoiding thinking about you, because every thought about you was a trip back to that Christmas night. I have spent 5 months redefining who I am without you in my life, and that has been liberating. Daniel nodded slowly, as if understanding there was no argument that could refute that truth. I need you to hear something specifically, I continued. You can spend the rest of your life in therapy. You can reach complete clarity about your mistakes. You can become the best version of yourself. But that does not mean I will trust you again. That does not mean I will allow you to return to my life. Trust is not something recovered with time and good intentions. Trust once destroyed so completely is dead. So there is no way, Daniel began. There is a way, I interrupted. A way that takes years, not months. A way where you demonstrate consistently through actions, not words that you have really changed. But that path does not include your father in the present. That path includes you living your own life, experiencing the consequences of your actions, and slowly, perhaps, after several years, rebuilding something. But that something will never be what once was. It will be different. It will be based on boundaries, not vulnerability. Daniel listened in silence. Jacob continues to be your son, I added. Eventually he can make his own decisions about what role you want to play in his life, but that will be his decision, not mine. I barely see Jacob once a month. We keep in contact, but the dynamic has changed. He is more adult in his interactions with me now. He understands the world is not the fairy tale place he once thought it was. Is that all? Daniel asked after a long silence. That is all, I confirmed. There is no quick reconciliation. There is no emotional hug where everything is forgiven. There is simply a door that is closed. Perhaps in some years that door opens slightly, but for now it is closed. Daniel got up from the seat. He did not try to argue more. He simply stood up, nodded once, and left the cafe. As I watched him leave, I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel anger. I felt mainly exhaustion. The exhaustion of having finally closed a chapter that had been open too long, bleeding into the new pages I was trying to write. December 2024. Exactly a year after the night that fundamentally changed who I was. I am sitting on the terrace of my apartment in San Diego, looking toward the Pacific Ocean as the sun descends toward the horizon, dyeing the sky with oranges and purples that seem almost impossible in their beauty. A glass of red wine rests on the table next to me. It is not the Napa Valley wine Daniel once enjoyed. It is a wine from a local vineyard, humble but genuinely satisfying. I've been reflecting for weeks on how to summarize this year, how to encapsulate the transformation I have experienced since that early morning when I was hospitalized with fractures and a crushing realization that the family I thought I had never really existed. The reality is I am not the same person I was 365 days ago, but neither am I someone completely new. I am someone who has been distilled, refined, purified through pain. All illusions have been burned. What remains is something stronger, although also more fragile in some ways. It is the fragility that comes from having seen the complete abyss of human depravity and having realized that that depravity is capable of germinating in the hearts of those we love most deeply. My import trade consultancy has prospered in a way I did not anticipate. I have now 6 established clients, all medium-sized companies operating within the region. The work is satisfying not in the sense that it is exciting or transformative, but in the sense that it is useful. It allows me to generate income without being tied to the identity of important businessman, which once was so central to who I thought I was. I have discovered I can be effective in my profession without needing that profession to define my value as a person. Daily life is different now. Mornings I spend in my office working on trade documentation, minor international negotiations market analysis. Afternoons I dedicate to long walks on the beach. I have developed a consistent exercise routine. I go to the movies regularly. I have made new friends and San Diego people who know nothing about my previous history, who know me simply as an interesting older man who works in the food industry. Jacob continues to visit me every month, usually the first weekend. He is now 17. He has grown dramatically during this year, not only in physical size but in emotional maturity. The visits have evolved from tense interactions where he was clearly processing the collapse of his family to genuinely deep conversations about life, meaning morality. About 3 weeks ago, during his November visit, he asked me something that surprised me. "Grandpa, do you ever think about forgiving Dad?" I reflected on the question for several minutes before answering. Forgiving does not mean what most people think it means, Jacob. Forgiving does not mean saying that what someone did is okay. It does not mean allowing that person back into your life without fundamental changes. Forgiving simply means letting go of the anger that consumes you. "And have you let go of the anger?" he asked. "Mostly," I answered honestly. Years ago, anger was what motivated me. It was what allowed me to take difficult decisions. It was what allowed me to protect myself. But now, anger is more like smoke. It is still there, but it no longer hides my vision. I can see it, recognize it, and choose not to allow it to control me. Jacob nodded, processing that. "Your father is rebuilding his life," I continued. "It is a slow process. He will probably face financial struggles for years. He will probably experience moments of despair. That is the consequences of his actions. I am not causing that. I am simply allowing the natural consequences of what he did to remain without interference from my part. Rose visits me regularly too. My sister is one of the few people who truly understands the complexity of what we have experienced. She has been a witness to the destruction of a family from the inside. She too has had to reconsider what family loyalty means when that family commits unforgivable acts. 2 months ago, during one of her visits, Rose told me something that has remained with me. "David, something I have never told you. When Daniel was young, around 12, I remember you spoke to me about your fear that he might not be the person you hoped he would be. You said you saw in him a tendency to take shortcuts, to look for the easy route. You said you feared not being able to teach him enough about the importance of integrity. I remember I thought you were too hard, that he was simply a child, but I think you knew something then that took years to materialize. I do not know if that is true. My memory of Daniel when he was young is now inseparable from the knowledge of who he became, but Rose is probably right. Maybe there were always signs I ignored because I loved my son more than I wished to see who he really was. That is perhaps the most painful lesson of this year. Love does not always see clearly. Love often sees what it wishes to see. Love can be completely blind to the truth when the truth is too painful to accept. I have made significant changes in my final arrangements. My will now designates Jacob as the main beneficiary, with significant protections in place to guarantee wealth is not accessible until he turns 25. I have established a small endowment for organizations working with victims of domestic violence and family abuse. I have designated Rose as executor of my estate, trusting her integrity in a way I can no longer trust my son. The night before this night of reflection, I received a call from Ethan. My private detective has remained peripherally in my life, sending occasional updates about Daniel. Tonight's update was that my son had completed his 2 years of probation without recorded violations, that he had kept his job in logistics, that he was living relatively stably, although financially limited. What does that mean? I asked. It means he has made enough changes not to be an immediate danger to himself or others. Ethan answered, if that is genuine or simply superficial, I cannot determine, but externally, he is operating as a functional citizen. That is enough for me. I do not need Daniel to redeem himself. I do not need him to become someone admirable. I simply need him to live in a way that does not represent a continuous threat. As I finish my wine and watch the ocean transform from gold to gray as the sun disappears completely, I understand this is the point where my story ends. Not because I have reached a definitive ending. Life continues. Jacob will keep growing. Eventually more birthdays will come. More Christmases, more ordinary moments of human existence. Human. But the saga of betrayal, of discovery, of conflict, of transformation, of the final break with Daniel, ends here. It ends in a place where a man is sitting by the ocean in peace with himself, not because everything is resolved, but because he has learned that peace does not require complete resolution. It simply requires the acceptance that some broken things are never completely repaired, and that is okay. Because it also requires us to understand that we can be someone new, someone better, someone wiser, built on the foundations of what we once were, but not prisoners of it. A year after that Christmas night, I am free, not because the damage has been erased, but because finally I have accepted that damage is part of me now, and that is precisely what allows me to rebuild myself in a way innocence could never have allowed. If you like this story, support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave us your opinions in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box appearing on the left. Thank you for joining us.